This video covers the topic of logic and its various uses within argumentation. I'm going to be talking about logic as a thing. I'm going to be talking about formal and informal logic. I'm going to be talking about a system devised by a philosopher named Stephen Toulmin. And then I'm going to end with a brief discussion of logical fallacies. The material that I'm covering is in chapters 4 and 7 and appendix 1 of our textbook. I'm not going to ask you if everybody who's watching this knows who the photograph is of here. This is, of course, of the rapper Logic, who's been in the news much lately. In terms of argument, logic is a component, but it's not the only component. But it may very well be one of the most important components. Every argument has to have some logical basis. It can't be based on pure emotion, which is a form of pathos, and it can't be based entirely on the credibility of the author, what we tend to call ethos. Okay, arguments by their very nature are intended to change the audience's thinking. To help with that process, you have to make an appeal that is fundamentally grounded in logic. But we might want to make a distinction here between formal logic, which I'll talk about in a second, and real world logic, which is where Stephen Toulmin comes in. We also need to mention briefly here the idea of assumptions, that the audience is the person you're trying to influence, and they have beliefs, values, and a sense of logic that may or may not be congruent with your own. So you've always got to be careful with that. Logos versus logic. This is something that a lot of people get mixed up. And so I thought I'd spend a little tiny bit of time on it. When we talk about logos, we're talking about an appeal type. And we're talking again about how you can appeal to an audience sense of reason. We use evidence for that. We use an internally consistent argument that flows logical from point to point to point, that's all designed to back up a particular claim. A component of an appeal to logos is an enthymeme, and that is this claim that we've talked about before in the types of claim discussion. And it's necessarily incomplete because it's what we think. It's a claim with reasons, but then the audience fills in assumptions, beliefs, values in order to make it complete. Logic, as distinct from an appeal to logos, is systematic thinking of different kinds that helps us to support a decision. Philosophically, we always talk about deductive and inductive logic, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then for our purposes, and something our textbook relies on very heavily, is this idea of logic as seen through the eyes of the philosopher Stephen Toulmin. Formal logic has a mathematical kind of quality to it, and a lot of logicians, and I am not. I was a logistics officer, but where the word is also used, but I was not a logician. I have worked with logicians. They're mostly philosophers with a mathematical bent, and they can reduce logical connections to formulas, and they can express that mathematically or symbolically. They generally fall into two different kinds of logic. Deductive, where we move from some kind of general principle that we apply to a specific case, or we look at the process of induction, where we gather a variety of specifics, gather a variety of examples or data or information into a ball, and we draw some general conclusion from that. And of course, you all know who this is, the famous Spock from Star Trek, who was noted for saying that's not logical all the time, and then would sometimes act logically and sometimes not. Deductive reasoning fundamentally is about classifying things. It's about identifying things and putting them into categories, a little bit like definition claims. The basic way that we tend to look at deduction is in the form of a syllogism that has a major premise, that is some kind of general principle, a minor premise that's a specific example, and then we look at the minor premise in the light of the major premise, and we draw a conclusion. So it has these parts, these three parts to it. Here's the classic example, and again, this comes from Aristotle, like so many other notions of logic. All humans are mortal. That is, every one of us who's a human being is eventually going to die. Nobody's going to live forever. Our minor premise is an example, and we say, okay, Megan, for example, is a human being. Okay, so if all humans are mortal and Megan is a human, then we can conclude that Megan is mortal. You can't conclude anything else from that. You've got an A and a B here, you've got a C and an A, and then you've got a C equals B. Okay, so that's kind of the way it works. A, B, C, A, C, B. So you can express that kind of symbolically. There are problems with this. One is you can develop a syllogism that is valid in terms of its form, but it could be not true. And here we have a good example of that. All cats have 4 legs. I have 4 legs. Therefore, I'm a cat. The problem here is that this dog, A, we know just by looking at him, is not a cat, but the problem is really the major premise. Okay, 4 legs is not specific enough to cats. Aardvarks have 4 legs. Tigers have 4 legs, well, they're kind of cat. Elephants have 4 legs. Iguanas have 4 legs. So 4-leggedness is not sufficient to define a cat. One of my students last semester when I posed this said, the one sure thing we know about cats is that cats retract their claws when they walk, and it turns out they do. They're the only animal that does that. And all cats, whether they're big cats or little cats, tigers or house cats, retract their claws when they walk. When you're looking for a paw print, like for a bobcat, you'll notice that there aren't any claws. So if he had used that, then clearly he would be pushed out of this because, as we know, dogs don't retract their claws when they walk. Dogs have their claws out all the time. So here we have a syllogism that is valid in that it has the same form. Cats have 4 legs, I have 4 legs, therefore I'm a cat. But it's wrong because the major premise is defective. Okay, so that's deductive logic. It works for classification, it works for putting things into categories, but it's problematic because it has very limited use. The real world is a lot messier than this. As I've talked about, it is a messy business. They're abstract. It works well for abstracts. And it's relatively uncommon in argument, except when you're trying to put together what our textbook calls a reasoned sequence of ideas, as we logically go from one point to another, and we can draw maybe a deduction at the end of that. If you go back to chapter 8 and you look at the rhetorical analysis essays that we looked at, Lopez, I think, is fundamentally trying to use deductive logic. And she does that by saying, all of the, any form of artificial creation of a child is wrong. Therefore, I have to look at this egg donation business and decide that I can classify this in a way where it is simply wrong. And morally, it's not acceptable. Okay. Goodman doesn't use deductive logic so much, as I think she uses a different form. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Inductive reasoning is the mirror image of deductive reasoning. We take a whole bunch of observations and then we draw some kind of conclusion about it. Induction is largely invented by Aristotle, by the way. He's the guy who first designs a system of logic based on what he sees around him. Plato is really the king of deductive logic, and Aristotle's development of inductive logic is a very direct critique of the kind of rigid formalism that Plato relies on. Okay. One of the problems with induction is that whatever conclusion we draw is always conditional. If we get new facts, if we get more information, we might have to change our conclusion. Okay. And induction is actually fairly common in argument. Our claim is drawn from the evidence that we develop. Okay. My example down here at the bottom is a little difficult to see because it doesn't show you the end because my picture's on it. But for thousands of years, everybody in the West believed that the swans only came in white. If you looked up swan in whatever kind of dictionary or reference work you were looking at from Roman times to about the middle of the 18th century, all swans would have been white. Problem was, Captain James Cook in 1750 goes to Australia, British explorer, finds the continent of Australia, first Westerner to show up there. And suddenly they find all kinds of weird animals. They find koala bears, they find kangaroos, they find wallabies, they find Tasmanian devils, and they find, ta-da, black swans. Swans that are exactly like their European counterparts, but they're black. So suddenly the definition of swan has to change to include both black and white swans. This is an example of inductive reasoning. Okay, so again, it's taking evidence and drawing a conclusion from it. That's what induction's all about. These are two systems of formal logic. In the real world, we tend to make decisions on a little bit more complicated basis. And that brings us to the work of this man, Stephen Toulmin. Stephen Toulmin lived from 1922 to 2009. He was a British philosopher. He taught in the United States as well as in England. He was actually in the RAF as a pilot during World War II. So he's a very interesting guy. And his notion of logic is based on what he observed in courtrooms, uh, where he watched lawyers at work making cases to a jury. And he found that you had two different notions of the truth expressed to an audience, and the audience had to make up its mind. If you think about it, that's fundamentally the way argument works. You have multiple perspectives, and the audience has to figure it out. His insight is also drawn from the notion that there's no absolute right or wrong, and you certainly know that there's no particular issue on which everyone agrees is perfectly right or perfectly wrong. The best justification for a claim is the best position to hold. So he involves the idea not only of coming up with a claim with justification with support for it, and uses some special terms for that we'll get to in a second, but he recognizes the primacy of audience in this. If the audience doesn't buy it, your argument doesn't work. And so the role of the audience is key. To get to this point, Toulmin uses some different terms from what we tend to use in argument. One that is similar is the idea of a claim. It's the position that we hold. You've drawn some kind of conclusion based on a series of facts, and it's what you want the audience to accept. The facts that we use to support our claim, he calls data. And I tend to use the same term myself. I use data, I use information, okay? The warrant is the part of the enthymeme where the audience plays a role. He calls this the warrant. Stated and sometimes they're stated, sometimes they're unstated. The assumptions, why the audience should connect the data and the claim. Backing is additional support for the warrant. That is, why do you think your audience thinks this way? So backing helps you figure out what the warrant is. That is, what the audience is thinking. And data is the information that you develop that helps you support your claim. He has this really important concept of conditions of rebuttal, which he tends to think of as alternatives. And again, as we've talked about before, argument is not pro-con, it's more complicated than that. So what he argues is that we need to always think of reasons not to do what our claim says we want to do. What are some reasons not to do that? What are some alternative positions, and why are they better or worse than what we want to do? And then he also has this idea of qualifiers. We can't say, running is good for everybody. We'd have to say for many people, running is a good activity because it's inexpensive and it's easy enough to do, and it promotes good, healthy bodies. But some people can't run. People in a wheelchair can't run. People who are in their 90s can't run. People with severe arthritis, like I have, can't run. That's why I swim so much. So qualifiers are not so much weaselly words, and many of my students think that, I should be able to just say absolutely. I said, you can't. Most human beings will go along or not go along with you based on qualifiers, because you can't prescribe one thing for everybody. And again, that's because the warrants, the unstated assumptions, the beliefs, the values that our audiences have differ from person to person and culture to culture. And so there are very few universal considerations. Okay. So what does this look like? Well, here's an example that comes actually from our textbook. And I've made this little chart to kind of lay it out. And this is one that I got from a site that concerns itself with Toulmin. And then I filled in all the red stuff. Here's a fact. We know that SeaWorld and places like it, Marineland of the Pacific, SeaWorld in Florida, are unnatural environments for animals, although we like to go look at the whales or the dolphins or whatever they are in there. Okay, why are they unnatural? Well, because sea animals by nature live in an open ocean, and it's very difficult to recreate that experience in a land-based environment. Therefore, our conclusion, our claim should be, your public should not support such parks. And you guys have all seen Free Willy, or you've seen Blackfish. You know what I'm talking about here. These are documentaries that have to do with marine animals kept in captivity. Okay, how do we know that these environments are harmful? Well, we have some studies that show that. These are some of the warrants and the facts that we have to go with this. Okay, well, what backing do we have? Well, we know that numerous experts don't approve of this. We can look at studies We can look at documentaries. We can look at information that says that animals that in these kind of environments don't live very long. They don't live as long as they do in the wild. And then another piece of backing here, and this might be helpful in terms of your audience, that we shouldn't harm animals for our entertainment. You know, we all got mad years ago when Michael Vick was accused of dog fighting, and so these kinds of animal shows fit into the same thing, that gratuitous cruelty to animals just to amuse us is not something we care for. That's why circuses don't have elephants anymore. That's why circuses without elephants tend to go out of business. We like to look at them, but the more we know about how badly treated some of these animals are in some cases, the more people say, I don't want to see a show with animals who are being harmed just for me. Okay. Well, there is a qualifier possibility here. Well, what if you could have a park that does replicate ocean environment? And I'm thinking here of the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California, which is actually open to Monterey Bay. And even though the animals are in captivity in a way, the natural environment is such that the animals can be kept safely in captivity. Okay, so this is kind of an example of how these different pieces work in Toulmin's system. It's 99% identical to what we tend to think of as argument. It just uses a little bit different terms and a little bit different structure to get us there. But it makes us think about these things in more complex ways, where it's not so much either or, this, that, yes, no, black, white, pro, con, but it makes us think more complexly and more fully and comprehensively about these issues. Here's some simple ones. These are made by some students at University of Pennsylvania several years ago in a Toulmin class. Here's the claim: cats make good pets. Why? Because they're independent. What's the qualifier? Well, usually cats are independent. Not all cats are. What grounds or backing do we have? Well, scientists say that cats can survive without much attention. One of our beliefs here is that independent animals make good pets. How do we know that this is a good warrant? Well, we know that from studies that independent animals are happier and live longer. Okay. Well, there are some reasons why cats might be lousy pets. They could be just jerks. They might bite and scratch. I had a cat like that for years who just hated me. Some people, like my wife's sister, are allergic to cats, so cats would not be a good pet for her. Okay. And cats are really difficult to go running with. Dogs, on the other hand, most dogs, like to run with us, and they can manage it. Cats, on the other hand, that's not what they do. So here you can kind of see a silly Toulmin argument, but you can see how these pieces work out. Here's another silly one with our favorite actor, Sylvester Stallone. And this actually is a takeoff on the classic deductive logic syllogism. Stallone is mortal because he is human. Well, we have some qualifiers. Most people would agree he's human if we agree that he's human. Okay, how do we know he's human? Well, he looks like a human. We could go find his birth certificate and his medical records, and we could say, yes, he is indeed a human being. What's our warrant? All humans are mortal. We're all going to die. We know that. How do we know that that's true? Well, there's studies on the physical nature of human beings that nobody's lived forever yet. Excuse me. And therefore, we can say that this is absolutely true. Well, what if Beavis from outer space? What if this whole thing is a fraud? Another thing to think about here is, well, what if he lives forever through his films? What if we change the definition of mortality and say that if you can be seen or heard after your death, maybe in some way you're still alive? So again, these are silly sort of Toulmin ideas, but it gives you an idea of the range and the complexity and the comprehensiveness of Toulmin's approach to argument. You may be all very confused by this. So take a look at chapter 4, and that'll give you a very nice discussion of Toulmin that's probably much better than my own. There's a sample student essay that carefully follows Toulmin's argument form, and you'll see in there that they've labeled the pieces to indicate what's a claim, what's a warrant, what's data, what's backing, things like that. Chapter 7 in our textbook, which I'll talk about a little bit more in another video, talks about audience. And then under the course content stuff for week 4, you'll see some information on logic, and you'll see some handouts on argument organization. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to make a separate video with the slides on logical fallacies, because this one's gone long enough for you already. Thank you.